My world collapsed when his supposed coworker called asking why he hadn't shown up in months. Turns out the man I married was living a complete lie. I never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, trying to process what my life has become. 3 years. 3 entire years of marriage built on what I now know was a foundation of lies so elaborate that I'm still discovering new pieces of the deception. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. I was making coffee, the same routine we'd had for years, him rushing around getting ready for his important job downtown, me preparing for another day working from home. He kissed me goodbye, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door just like he had every morning for the past 3 years. Except this time, about an hour later, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, confused. Someone asking for my husband, saying they were calling from his workplace because he hadn't shown up in 3 months and they were concerned. 3 months. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee mug trembling in my hand, trying to process what I was hearing. The caller was asking if he was okay, if there had been a family emergency, why he hadn't returned their calls or responded to emails. I mumbled something about checking with him and hung up, my mind racing. 3 months? But he'd been leaving every morning, coming home every evening with stories about his day, his colleagues, the projects he was working on. He complained about difficult clients just last week. He'd mentioned his boss's new haircut 2 days ago. How could he not have been at work for 3 months? The rest of that day passed in a blur of confusion and growing dread. I kept checking my phone, wanting to call him but not knowing what to say. How do you ask your husband if he's been lying about going to work without sounding completely insane? When he came home that evening, carrying the same leather briefcase he always did, looking tired in the same way he always looked after a long day, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the phone call. But I hadn't. I asked casual questions about his day, watching his face carefully as he told me about a meeting that apparently never happened with people who probably didn't exist. The man I'd been married to for 3 years, who I thought I knew better than anyone, was lying to my face with such ease that it terrified me. That night, after he fell asleep, I did what any rational person would do. I started digging. I went through his laptop, his phone, his email accounts. What I found shattered everything I thought I knew about our life together. Bank statements showing withdrawals I didn't recognize, credit card charges for things that made no sense, and most disturbing of all, evidence that this deception went back much further than 3 months. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since I made that discovery, and honestly, I wish I could go back to being ignorant. The rabbit hole I fell down was deeper and more twisted than I ever could have imagined. After that first night of investigation, I realized I needed to be methodical about this. I couldn't just confront him without understanding the full scope of what was happening. So I started keeping a journal, documenting every lie, every inconsistency, every piece of evidence I uncovered. It became an obsession, and maybe that wasn't healthy, but I needed to know the truth. The bank statements were the first real clue. For the past 8 months, there had been no direct deposits from his supposed employer. None. Instead, there were irregular deposits from various sources, some legitimate-looking business transactions, some cash deposits, some transfers that I couldn't identify. The amounts varied wildly, sometimes more than his supposed salary, sometimes much less. Where was this money coming from? I started following him. I know how that sounds, and I felt sick doing it, but I had to know where he was going every day when he left the house. The first morning I tailed him, I expected him to head downtown toward his office building. Instead, he drove to a coffee shop about 15 minutes away, sat there for 2 hours reading newspapers and scrolling through his phone, then drove to a completely different part of town. That's where things got really strange. He went to this rundown office building, the kind of place that looks like it houses questionable businesses and tax preparation services that only operate during tax season. He stayed there for about 4 hours, then drove home via the grocery store, buying exactly the kind of items someone would buy if they wanted to make it look like they'd been busy all day. I watched this routine for 3 days straight, taking vacation time from my own job to do it. Each day was slightly different, but the pattern was the same. Coffee shop, mysterious office building, some random errands to kill time, then home with a story about his day that bore no resemblance to reality. On the 4th day, I decided to go into the building after he left. The directory in the lobby was mostly empty, but one name caught my attention, a private investigation service on the 3rd floor. My blood ran cold. Was my husband a private investigator? Had he been lying about his job because of some kind of confidentiality issues? But that didn't explain the missing 3 months, or why his supposed employer had never heard of a leave of absence. I didn't have the courage to knock on any doors that day, but I did notice something else. There were cameras everywhere in that building, and they looked newer and more sophisticated than you'd expect for such a rundown place. Someone was definitely keeping close tabs on who came and went. That evening, I tried a different approach. I started asking him more specific questions about his work, testing the consistency of his stories. I asked about the colleague who had called me, pretending I'd remembered something about him mentioning this person before. He didn't miss a beat, creating an elaborate backstory for this person who, according to his actual workplace, didn't exist. The scariest part wasn't just that he was lying, it was how good he was at it. Every detail was consistent with previous lies, every story built perfectly on the fictional foundation he'd created. This wasn't someone making things up on the spot. This was someone who had constructed an entire alternate reality and was living in it so completely that I started questioning my own sanity. I began to notice other things too. His phone habits had changed over the past year, though I'd attributed it to work stress at the time. He was always stepping out to take calls, keeping his phone face down during dinner, taking it with him to the bathroom. His laptop was password protected in a way it never had been before. He'd started doing his own laundry, which I thought was sweet and helpful, but now I wondered what he didn't want me to see. The worst part was how normal everything else seemed. He was still the same person in every other way, affectionate, thoughtful, remembering little things about my day, bringing me flowers for no reason. We still laughed together, still had our inside jokes, still felt like a team when dealing with family drama or household problems. How could someone compartmentalize deception this completely? By the end of those 2 weeks, I had filled an entire notebook with observations, questions, and theories. I had photocopies of bank statements, screenshots of weird financial transactions, a timeline of when his behavior had started changing. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, and it was exhausting. But I still didn't have answers to the biggest questions. What was he actually doing all day? Where was the money coming from? And most importantly, who was the man I was married to? Update 2. I never expected writing these updates to be therapeutic, but somehow putting all of this into words has helped me process the insanity of my situation. It's been another month since my last update, and I finally have some answers. I wish I didn't. After weeks of surveillance and investigation that made me feel like I was losing my mind, I decided to take a more direct approach. I hired a private investigator. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hiring someone to investigate whether my husband might be a private investigator himself, but at that point, I was beyond caring about irony. The PI I hired was a woman about my age who came highly recommended and seemed to understand the delicate nature of the situation. I gave her all the information I gathered, the building address, his daily routine, the financial irregularities, everything. She promised to be discreet and to focus on finding out what he was actually doing during those hours when he was supposed to be at work. Within a week, she had answers that I never could have prepared myself for. My husband wasn't a private investigator. He wasn't working any kind of legitimate job. He was running a small-scale fraud operation specifically targeting elderly people through phone scams and fake online investment opportunities. The office building I'd seen him visit was a rented space that housed several similar operations, all loosely connected and operating under the radar of law enforcement. The money coming into our accounts wasn't from a legitimate job, it was stolen from vulnerable people who trusted the lies he told them over the phone every day. While I was at home thinking he was working hard to support our future together, he was systematically destroying other people's financial security. When the PI showed me the evidence, photos of him at work, recordings of him on phone calls using a fake name and a completely different persona, bank records showing exactly where the money was coming from, I threw up. Actually threw up, right there in her office. The man I loved, the man I'd built a life with, was a criminal. But it got worse. The PI had also uncovered evidence that this wasn't his first time doing this kind of work. Before we moved to our current city 3 years ago, he'd been involved in similar operations in 2 other states. Each time, he disappeared when things got too hot, creating a new identity and starting over somewhere else. Our entire relationship, our marriage, our life together, it had all been just another cover story for him. The most devastating revelation was that I wasn't his first wife. He'd been married twice before, using the same pattern, create a legitimate-seeming life with a woman who could provide cover and stability, run scams for a few years, then disappear when the heat got too intense. The other wives had no idea either until it was too late. I spent 3 days in a hotel room after getting this information, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand explanations, to give him a chance to tell me it was all a misunderstanding. But a bigger part of me was terrified. If he was capable of this level of deception, if he'd done this to other women before, what would he do if he knew I'd discovered the truth? The PI advised me to contact law enforcement before confronting him, both for my own safety and to prevent him from disappearing again. But she also warned me that building a case against him would take time, and that I needed to be very careful not to tip him off in the meantime. So I went home and pretended everything was normal. I smiled when he kissed me hello, asked about his fictional day at his non-existent job, made dinner while he told me elaborate stories about colleagues who didn't exist. All while knowing that the money paying for our groceries had been stolen from someone's grandmother, someone's retirement fund, someone's life savings. The acting required to maintain that facade was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to force him to face what he'd done. But I knew that would only give him the opportunity to spin more lies or, worse, to disappear and start over somewhere else with another unsuspecting woman. Instead, I started working with the authorities to build a case. I provided them with all the evidence I'd gathered, connected them with the PI who had uncovered the details of his operation, and agreed to help them gather additional evidence from inside our home. They installed monitoring equipment to record his phone conversations and track his computer activity. Our house became a crime scene investigation while I lived in it, pretending to be a loving wife. The psychological toll of those weeks was enormous. I started having panic attacks, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was constantly on edge, afraid I'd say something wrong or act in a way that would make him suspicious. At the same time, I was grieving the loss of everything I thought my life was, the man I thought I married, the future we'd planned together, the basic sense of reality I'd taken for granted. I also couldn't stop thinking about his previous wives, wondering if they'd felt the same sense of betrayal and violation when they discovered the truth. I found myself hoping they'd gotten out safely, hoping they'd been able to rebuild their lives after having them destroyed so completely. The hardest part was maintaining intimacy with someone I now knew was a stranger. How do you kiss someone goodnight when you know they've spent the day stealing from vulnerable people? How do you make small talk over dinner when every word out of their mouth is potentially a lie? How do you share a bed with someone when you're not sure if they're dangerous? 3 weeks into this nightmare, law enforcement finally had enough evidence to move forward. They told me they'd be making arrests soon and that I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that my husband would realize what was happening and might try to flee. They advised me to stay somewhere safe during the arrest and to be prepared for media attention, since fraud cases involving multiple victims often attracted public interest. I packed a bag and went to stay with my sister, telling my husband I needed to help her with some family situation. It felt strange to tell him a lie after discovering that our entire relationship was built on them, but I didn't know what else to do. He seemed concerned and caring, telling me to take as much time as I needed, that he'd handle everything at home. Even knowing what I knew, part of me still responded to that caring tone, still felt grateful for his support. The psychological manipulation was so complete that I questioned my own reality even while holding evidence of his crimes. The arrests were made on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there to see it, but the PI called to let me know that they'd taken him and several others into custody without incident. She said he seemed genuinely shocked, which suggested he'd had no idea that anyone was investigating him. That should have made me feel better, but instead it just reinforced how completely he'd fooled me. If he could seem shocked by his own arrest, how could I trust any reaction he'd ever had to anything? Final update. It's been 6 months since the arrest, and I'm finally ready to share what happened next. I've been through more therapy than I thought possible, moved to a different state, and started rebuilding my life from scratch. Writing this final update feels like closing a chapter on the strangest, most traumatic period of my life. The trial was a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. What the initial investigation had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. As more evidence came to light, it became clear that my husband's criminal enterprise was much larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. He wasn't just running phone scams, he was part of an organized network that had been operating for over a decade, targeting elderly and vulnerable people across multiple states. The financial damage was staggering. Hundreds of victims had lost their life savings, their retirement funds, money they'd set aside for medical care or to leave to their children. During the trial, I had to sit there and listen to testimony from people whose lives had been destroyed by the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years. An 80-year-old woman who'd lost her house. A retired veteran who'd given up his entire pension to what he thought was a legitimate investment opportunity. A widow who'd been convinced to hand over the life insurance money from her deceased husband. The prosecution used evidence gathered from our home, including recordings of him making calls while I was in the next room, completely unaware that he was systematically destroying someone's financial security. Hearing his voice on those recordings, using names and personas I'd never heard before, was like listening to a complete stranger who happened to sound like my husband. But the most shocking revelation came during the sentencing phase. The prosecution revealed that he had a criminal history going back almost 20 years, with fraud convictions in multiple states under different identities. He'd served time in prison twice before, something I never could have discovered during our relationship because he'd been using a completely fabricated identity the entire time we were together. Even his name was fake. The man I'd married, whose last name I'd taken, whose identity I'd legally tied myself to, didn't exist. The real person was someone with a long criminal record, a history of abandoning wives and families when his schemes fell apart, and absolutely no connection to the life story he'd told me about his childhood, his family, his past relationships. During the trial, his defense attorney tried to paint him as someone who'd been trying to go straight, who'd married me because he genuinely wanted to change his life. They argued that he'd been supporting me and trying to build a legitimate future, just struggling with old habits and bad influences. It was manipulation even during his trial, trying to use our relationship as evidence of his supposedly good character. I testified against him, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Sitting there in court, looking at this person I thought I knew completely, having to recount the details of our life together while knowing it had all been an elaborate lie, was surreal. His attorney tried to suggest that I must have known something was wrong, that I was either complicit or willfully ignorant. That questioning of my own judgment, my own sanity, was something I'm still working through in therapy. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with restitution ordered for his victims. The restitution amount was in the millions, money that will never be recovered because it was spent as quickly as it was stolen. Those people will never get their lives back, never recover what they lost to someone who saw their trust and vulnerability as opportunities to exploit. After the sentencing, he tried to contact me through his attorney, wanting to arrange a meeting to explain everything and make things right. I declined. What explanation could possibly make sense of 3 years of elaborate deception? What could he say that would undo the violation of having my entire life built on lies? The legal proceedings also revealed that I was the third wife he'd deceived this way, not the second as I'd initially learned. There had been another woman between his previous marriage and ours, someone who discovered his deception early and left before he could cause as much damage. Learning about her gave me some hope that it was possible to recover from this kind of betrayal, but it also reinforced how calculated and deliberate his actions had been. The financial aftermath was its own nightmare. Everything we'd owned together was seized as part of the criminal asset forfeiture, since it had all been purchased with stolen money. Our house, our cars, our savings accounts, even jewelry he'd given me, all of it was taken to help compensate his victims. I was left with literally nothing except my own personal belongings and the income from my own job. Starting over at 35 with no assets, no credit history that wasn't tied to a criminal, and no savings was terrifying. I had to move back in with family temporarily while I figured out how to rebuild my financial life. Getting approved for an apartment lease, opening new bank accounts, even getting a cell phone plan was complicated by the fact that my identity had been tied to his fraudulent one for years. The emotional recovery has been even more challenging than the financial one. The violation of trust was so complete, so fundamental, that it shattered my ability to believe in my own judgment about people. If I could be so completely deceived by someone I lived with for 3 years, how could I trust myself to recognize deception in anyone else? I've learned that what I experienced is called intimate fraud, financial crimes committed by romantic partners, and it's more common than I ever imagined. There are support groups for people who've been through similar experiences, and connecting with others who understood the unique trauma of discovering that your entire relationship was a criminal enterprise has been invaluable. The healing process has been slow and nonlinear. Some days I feel strong and independent, proud of myself for surviving something so devastating and rebuilding my life from nothing. Other days I feel angry and stupid, furious at myself for missing what now seem like obvious red flags, devastated by the realization that someone I loved never existed at all. I've had to relearn how to trust people, starting with small things and working my way up. I've had to rebuild my sense of identity outside of a relationship that I now know was completely fabricated. I've had to forgive myself for being deceived by someone who was essentially a professional manipulator, someone who had decades of experience creating false identities and exploiting people's trust. Moving to a new state helped me start fresh without constantly being reminded of the life I thought I was living. I found a therapist who specializes in trauma from financial abuse and manipulation, and I've been working through not just the betrayal by my husband, but also the secondary trauma of having my entire reality questioned during the legal proceedings. I've also become involved in advocacy work, speaking to groups about financial fraud and intimate partner deception. Sharing my story has been part of my healing process, and I hope it helps other people recognize warning signs or feel less alone if they're going through something similar. 6 months later, I can say that life is getting better. I have my own apartment, my own car, my own bank accounts that no one else has access to. I'm building genuine friendships with people who know my story and accept me anyway. I'm learning to trust my instincts again, to believe that I can recognize authenticity in others because I now know what deception looks like. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe in a romantic relationship again, and I'm okay with that for now. The idea of being that vulnerable with another person, of sharing my financial life and my daily routine with someone who could potentially be lying about everything, still feels terrifying. But I'm working toward a place where I can be open to connection again, where I can trust without being naive. The strangest part of all of this is that I sometimes miss the person I thought he was. I know that person never existed, but the feelings I had for him were real, even if he wasn't. Grieving someone who never existed while simultaneously feeling grateful that they're out of your life is a complex emotional experience that I'm still working through. I want anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation to know that it's not your fault. Professional manipulators are exactly that, professional. They've spent years perfecting their ability to deceive people, to create false realities that feel completely authentic. Being deceived by someone like that doesn't make you stupid or naive, it makes you human. If something feels off in your relationship, trust that instinct. If financial things don't add up, ask questions. If someone gets defensive about transparency in areas where transparency should be normal, pay attention to that reaction. And if you discover that someone you love has been lying to you about fundamental aspects of their life, know that you deserve better and that it's possible to rebuild your life after that kind of betrayal. This experience taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined I could be. It taught me the difference between being trusting and being naive, between being loving and being a victim. Most importantly, it taught me that my worth isn't determined by someone else's ability to deceive me, and that I can build a life based on authenticity and truth, starting with my relationship with myself. The man I thought I married never existed, but the woman who survived discovering that truth is real and she's stronger than she ever knew she could be.